Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
Islamism is a global ideology. It has a strong anti Jewish orientation. There are Islamist governments and organizations in various parts of the world, such as Hamas in Gaza and the worldwide Muslim Brotherhood. Today, we look into the Islamist economy and networks, especially in the West. Sam Westrop is the director of Islamist Watch, a project of the Middle East Forum in the United States. Islamist Watch works to combat the ideas and institutions of Islamism in the United States and elsewhere in the West. I heard Sam speak at the Clarity Coalition, a coalition of Muslims, ex Muslims, and others who are concerned by the threat to liberty and peace posed by Islamists in various places around the world. Sam, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on our show.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
So we all know that Islam is the Muslim religion, but what is Islamism?
Well, that's a good question, and it doesn't have an entirely clear definition that is agreed upon by all sorts around the world. The Middle East Forum has a pretty clear definition, however. We believe Islamism is a modern ideology developed over the last few hundred years in which forces use the religion of Islam to try and impose a political ideal, an all-consuming political ideal, one that imposes Sharia law and other forms of theocracy upon its subjects. Most Islamists, but not all, seek a return to the caliphate, the idea of a supranational Islamic state. But there are many types of Islamists. Some you've mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas. Others draw from more religious origins in Saudi and South of Asia, places such as India. So there's all sorts of Islamists who believe slightly varying things, but they are all united by a belief in Sharia law and their desire to impose it upon the rest of us.
Now, Sharia law, most people know what it means, but why don't you define it a little bit better? Because they might say to all different sects of, to the Shiites and the Sunni, do they all believe in Sharia law?
Well, yes and no. There are certainly movements within Islam that downplay the idea of Sharia law being the responsibility of an Islamic government. There are those who differ on what exactly Sharia law comprises, whether you draw from just the Quran or the Sunnah, which is the behavior of the Prophet Muhammad, or indeed the ahadith, which are the reported sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So the extent of Sharia law, its role within a government, within an Islamic state or a secular state, huge amount of agreement and disagreement. There are plenty of moderate Muslims who oppose Islamism, who still regard some aspects of Sharia law as potentially useful, but they tend to see it as rules for their personal life rather than an omnipotent or an all-powerful established order to be imposed upon them and others. So no, it is enormously complicated. You mentioned Sunni and Shia, but those divide further into other sects that disagree with each other on these questions enormously. In fact, there are thousands of Islamic sects around the world. It is one of the most diverse religions around. And just as you have a diversity of Islamic thought, you also have a diversity of Islamist thought. And so the questions of Sharia get diluted and convoluted and developed across all of these competing ideas and forces to an unimaginable number of permutations. So it's a fascinating question, and it has real world consequences because, as we know, when Islamist groups are put into power, the sort of Sharia they implement is deadly. People are killed, people are tortured, people are wiped out, from the Yazidis to life under the Taliban to provinces now in places like Indonesia, where people are having their hands chopped off or whipped for accusations of fornication and so on. So it's an important subject that isn't just theoretical. It guides how terrorism and extremism and theocracy are implemented across the globe today.
So that brings me to this question. Is all Islamism going against the law of democratic countries?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there are certainly Islamists who use the processes of democracy to get elected. Now, the old argument is that once elected, I think there's a quote from President Erdogan, the Islamist leader of Turkey, that forgive me, I'll butcher the quote slightly, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, democracy is like a train, it gets you to where you want to go. So the idea is that democracy will take the Islamist ideal to a position of power, and then Islamism can replace any sense of democratic duty or process. And certainly across the West, we see Islamist groups frequently use democratic processes to gain influence, to gain money, to gain power, to gain control over Muslims as well. But whether there are Islamists who can permanently cohabitate with democracy is an interesting question. I would suggest no. Those who would disagree with me would point to places perhaps such as Tunisia, where the Ennahda party, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, ruled for a few years and peacefully surrendered power when it lost an election. Now, things have gone to pot in that country since, and indeed, you could also make the argument that they peacefully surrendered power because they wanted to peacefully obtain power in the future again. But maybe that's an example of Islamism moderating, of Islamism adapting to democratic realities. I don't know. It's an interesting question. But in general, I and my colleagues at the forum would say no, Islamism is a threat to democracy. It's a threat to anyone who believes in liberal democratic values. There are some moderate Muslim groups who are guilty of bits of Islamist thought encroaching in their worldview, who are very much geared towards a democratic participation. So, as I say, there are certainly caveats here. It's a really interesting question. I very rarely get a chance to ramble on about it, and I fear I have rambled on about it a bit here. But yes, by and large, no, Islamism is a threat, and we should see it as one of the ideologies that emerged in, especially from the 19th and 20th century, Romanticism, as a collectivist threat to liberty, as a collectivist threat to individualism. Islamism should be opposed at all junctures, whether in the West or in the East.
What kind of threat does Islamism pose to Jews, Israel, and the West?
Yeah. So Islamism, I think, is thought of perhaps not entirely correctly as an Eastern philosophy, as an Eastern ideal to be challenged. But that's not quite correct. Islamism grew out of ideologues who were very experienced with the West, who understood what the West was. In fact, Islamism is a response to the West, like fascism, like communism. Islamism emerged as a response to the success of liberal, capitalist, democratic Western states. There are many types of Islamism, as I've mentioned, but all of them are focused on the idea that the West is a threat, is a danger, and that Islam and Islamism can be utilized to challenge that threat.
Wait, explain. I know
A
this
threat
sounds
to what?
basic. Why is the West a threat? What is it that the West threatens?
Well, if you look at someone like Sayyid Qutb, whose writings and ideas inspired the Muslim Brotherhood, a great Egyptian thinker of the 30s and 40s, he went to the West. He lived in the United States for some time. He saw, as he saw it, the decadence of the West. He feared individualism. He feared what it would do to Muslims. He feared what it would do to Islam. And yet he also
To
saw
women, to women.
he feared freedom itself,
Mm.
because freedom was a challenge to control, and he believed, like all collectivists, that there needed to be collectivist control over the societies he wanted to run. And he was Egyptian, but he was based all over the Middle East. Now,
Wait. Does collectivism mean totalitarianism? Is that what you're using the word to mean, or authoritarianism when you say collectivist control?
yes, it's about the negation of the individual. So the collectivism is saying the collective is the supreme ideal, and the implicit consequence of that being that the individual can be sacrificed for the good of the collective. So by collectivism, I mean any ideology that seeks to sacrifice the individual for a so-called greater good. In the Islamist case, that greater good is Sharia, and is the triumph of the caliphate, the Islamic world, the Islamic Ummah. So yes, a lot of these Islamist founders were acutely aware of the West. South Asia, you had people like Abdul Alam Maududi, the founder of Jamaati Islami, the other huge Islamist group of the 20th century. He also very familiar with the West. Indeed, his writing was partly in response to the British Raj, the British control over what would become India and Pakistan many decades later. Indeed, even earlier, I mean, if you look at something like the Taliban, they come from a group called the Deobandis, very important South Asian Muslim sect. But the Deobandis only came about in the 19th century, and they came about in response to British rule, again, of the Raj, of what is now India. Every Islamist group around the world was formed partly in response to the presence of the West, or the perceived threat of the West. So Islamism is, to some extent, a Western ideology, in the sense that it was the success of the West that developed it, that encouraged it, that yielded it, like, as I say, socialism, like fascism. So these Islamists regarded the West, and continue to regard the West, as their greatest threat. And they see Jews as part of that. They see Jews as part of that threat. Now, obviously, there are some other angles to consider when you talk about Israel, and more historical questions of Jewish and Arab relationships. But by and large, the conflict today in Israel is driven by Islamism. Now, 40, 50 years ago, you could have pointed to Arabism and Arab nationalism and said, well, there's a slightly different driver there. But even those ideologies, to some extent, had some Islamist influence behind them, even if they competed with Islamists. I mean, Nasser, for example, was assassinated by Islamists. The Syrian leader, Assad, and his father have spent the last 5, 6 decades battling Islamists. But to some extent, their efforts against Israel and against Jews have been encouraged by Islamist fervor over the decades. But today, the threat against the state of Israel and against Jews worldwide is very much an Islamist-driven one. That is abundantly clear from groups like Hamas, but also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Hezbollah, even the PFLP, which is a Christian Marxist organization, is backed by Iran, by an Islamist state. Then, of course, you have all the underlying threats posed by groups states such as Turkey and Qatar, Pakistan, which just spoke out at the OIC today in support of Iran's planned retribution against Israel. All of these are Islamist states, or Islamist influenced states. So the battle against Israel and Jews is, yes, an Islamist one. And in the West, anti-Semitism is largely driven by the same Islamist fervor. We've just had months of anti-Israel encampments in British universities. And we've been looking closely at this. There's clear Islamist involvement here from foreign states such as Iran, and the US Director of National Intelligence recently confirmed that the Iranians had been financially supporting some of these encampments. To also here within Western Muslim communities, you find groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas closely involved with these encampments, indeed running some of them across the country. So Islamism poses, yes, a huge threat to Jews worldwide. And I think Jews have been slow to realize this, especially within Jewish leadership institutions. But the Western governments, Western security services have been wanting to turn a blind eye to this problem, because to acknowledge it would be to acknowledge the huge problem they have with Muslim populations in Western countries and the degree of Islamist control over these Muslim populations. It would also require them to face up to foreign states that they've often wanted to regard as useful allies in parts of the world. Turkey is a NATO member, and yet it is across Europe and the US. It runs mosques that spread the most vicious hatreds about the West, about Jews, about Israel. Certainly, we see little effort to contain that foreign interference by groups such as Turkey or Qatar. We see little efforts to enforce the law as it relates to foreign agents and rules and so on. We see little efforts to enforce the law as it relates to sanctions to do with Iran and so on. The law is not being enforced because governments in the West do not want to face up to the severity and the enormousness of the threat that they have allowed to develop over the last decade or so. So we have a serious problem on our hands.
I
And
have
the
a few.
outlook is very bleak.
Yeah, I have a few further questions about what you just said. Well, you said Islamists are behind or are involved with the protests at university encampments that we have seen in the past months after
And not
October
just in
7th.
Britain.
But you said in Great Britain, but I guess you also meant the United States. Is that correct?
Oh, I actually meant the United States. If
Oh,
I
you
said
meant the
Britain,
United States.
my
Okay.
apologies.
Okay.
There have been far fewer examples of encampments in Britain,
Okay.
but the US is where it led.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And is it what is it that Islamists, what problem do they have with Jews and Israel?
Well, that is an interesting question because it's not as clear perhaps as one would assume. Some Islamists would, perhaps more religious Islamists, for want of a better word, so groups like the Salafis or the Deobandis, might point to derogatory statements about the Jews in certain Islamic tracts. And so they would regard it perhaps more as a religious duty, a religious zeal to regard the Jews as a threat. But there's also the political Islamists, as we call them, so groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami. They take a slightly different tack. They regard the question of Israel and the plight of the Palestinians as a useful rallying call, as an effort to impose their own influence and to grow their own power in the West, in campuses, in mosques around the country. So, in other words, there's some evidence to suggest that political Islamists in the West actually don't care as much about the Palestinians as they would like you to believe, and that actually, if they were less concerned about growing their own influence and reputation and power, they might spend slightly less time on these questions. Certainly, anti-Semitism lies at the heart of Islamism, regardless, notwithstanding those points. There is, I think, ample evidence to suggest that as it relates to the encampments, especially, a lot of the most hateful rhetoric is driven by Islamists from all walks of life. But as to why Islamists hate the Jews are seen as, aside from the religious angle, are seen as Western. They are seen as crucial embodiments of the West, and you can see this in the rhetoric of clerics, of Islamist political activists across the country. There was a long-standing belief that Jews are not of the East, but of the West. There are other reasons too. I mean, certainly a lot of Islamists have bought into the conspiracy theories of European anti-Semitism. So the idea of Jewish control of media, of banks, and so on now features predominantly within Islamist publications and so on. But yeah, it's an extraordinary degree of hate, and the zeal, I think, encompasses many different approaches. But wherever you look, but it's important to say also that the Jews are not the only disliked people by the Islamists. I mean, I think the Hindu communities are beginning to realize now that anti-Hindu sentiment within Islamist circles is particularly egregious. And so, you know, there's a huge amount to discuss here. I'm sorry about the noise. This is unexpected. There's a huge amount of information to dissect and threats to understand about Islamist ideology. Indeed, you know, there are even other Muslims that Islamists despise. The Ahmadiyya, for example, are a particularly despised sect of Sunni Islam by Islamists. So we shouldn't be driven by the idea that Islamism is wholly and solely obsessed with Jews. No, it is opposed to all sorts of minorities. Jews are just, of course, the enemy number one in the minds of a lot of groups operating here in the West.
Okay.
I would say, before I ask the next question, I would say, and they're also an easier group to target, meaning it's a smaller, very specific group. So it's kind of handy the way Hitler started using his to form together his murderous coalition by focusing on the Jews. So Islamists can use Jews in the United States as a focal point for their encroachment into Western democracy, which is what brings me to which Islamist organizations in the United States form the biggest threat to Jewish interests and to free society in general.
Yeah, there's quite a few of those. I mean, if you start with the
Sorry.
yeah, if you start, I mean, we track several thousand Islamist organizations in the US. Now, a lot of those belong to the same movements and so on. But there's some key movements to mention. The Muslim Brotherhood we've discussed, Jamaati Islami, the Deobandis. Then you have Shia Islamists such as the Iranian-backed groups, but also pro-Iran Shias from Lebanese diasporas and South Asian diasporas as well, and all sorts of smaller sects from across South Asia, the Middle East, and even the Far East. We're looking in the moment into groups linked to the Malaysian government. In fact, the current Prime Minister of Malaysia is a graduate of a Virginia-based group of Islamists that were involved in the Muslim Brotherhood very closely. So there's all sorts of radicals. Of these groups, however, I would say a couple pose a particular threat. Of the Islamists in suits and ties, the respectable Islamists, the political Islamists, a couple of groups come to mind. One you've probably heard of is the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR. Very prominent. Now, they have many sister organizations and groups with which they work, also from the Muslim Brotherhood, groups like the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim American Society, groups aligned with the Turkish regime, like the US Council of Muslim Organizations. Then you have the South Asian Islamists in this country, very powerful, very wealthy. Their main outlet is a group called the Islamic Circle of North America, and they're openly tied to terrorists in South Asia. The Deobandis are much quieter. You're less likely to have heard of the groups, but they're operating. They have what are called Darul Uloom, seminaries, madrasas in Chicago and New York that are training hundreds of students with extreme anti-Semitic, anti-Western tracks every year. They're beginning to set up charities that are aligned with the Taliban. There's all sorts of groups operating. I wish I had time to name all the groups I thought posed a threat to the Jews. I fear we don't. But as I say, there are many thousands of mosques aligned with these organizations.
Here in the United States.
In the United States.
I wanted to make that. Sam, I'm going to ask you a question that I don't really expect you to answer, but I just personally cannot understand how Islam is living in a free democracy in the United States can look around and be willing to destroy all the freedoms that they have, including, let's be honest, the expensive cars many of them drive. I mean, I'm just saying, I just don't understand it. And I don't expect you to answer, but I just had to tell you, this frustrates me every day, not understand. I understand.
It's a reasonable point. I think the key thing is don't assume those driven by dogma can truly rationalize their zeal. I think at its most permissive, there's quite a good saying they used to use on kibbutz, on kibbutzes in Israel, which was, the more money you have, the more socialism you can afford. And I think the same is true of Islamists in the West. That it's very noticeable that so many of them are middle class, wealthy, well educated. The more freedom they have, the more Islamism they can afford, it seems. And some of these people would suffer terribly, truly, under a theocracy. Others are genuine believers in the cause and are willing to accept the violence and the hatred and the theocracy that their world would bring. But so many, especially the young in the mosques, the Muslim student associations, are indoctrinated. They buy into this world because they're told, imagine a world without usury, without having to pay credit card debt. Imagine a world without the scourge of homosexuality or the wickedness of alcohol and all these things. So it's quite easy to brainwash people with headline ideas if they've been brought up with a very particular Islamically informed view of good and bad.
And I have been told there is an immense fear of the afterlife. So
Sure. Well, I think we're getting more into the theological side of things there, but yeah, no, that governs everything. The concept of the present, of the present world, and the hereafter, and your actions here dictating your life in the hereafter. No, key not just to Islam but to Islamism as well. I just every day I'm dealing with Islamist adverts to donate for the construction of new mosques in the US, with specific reference to how much reward this was gaining you in the afterlife. So there's a huge amount of that driving it as well. Yes. No, I mean, look, radicalization is a complicated topic. And the question of how well thought through Islamists are, and how, whether they'd really flourish in the world they advocated, is an interesting one. And I suspect many would come to regret the brutality of this new world.
So, Sam, what are the activities of groups like CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations, Islamic Society of North America? What are their activities, and what relationship do they have with the government and with the Jewish community in the United States?
Well, most of these groups, I'm afraid to say, receive government funding, both at the federal and the state level, many millions, tens of millions of dollars.
For
Is
what?
this through a
For what?
501c3? Is that how they do it?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
Do they do it through a 501c3? In other words, they set up a nonprofit and that's how they
Sure.
get money from the government.
Many 501(c)s in operation. Also, don't forget the for-profit side of Islamism as well. Many businesses doing contracts with government and so on. No, there are about 5,000 Islamic 501(c)s in the United States that we know about. About 2 and a bit thousand of those are Islamist run. Funding from government comes from everything from funding for mosque security, to school vouchers is a huge one. Islamists run a huge number of private Islamic schools in this country. And so then Department of Agriculture subsidies through lunch programs is a huge source of income for them. No, there's no shortage. The Islamist groups, I mentioned a Virginia-based group earlier. One of their businesses has a multi-million-dollar contract with the U.S. Air Force. Huge amounts of grants go through USAID to humanitarian aid charities, Islamist humanitarian aid charities, to operate in places like Gaza and Kashmir. Just a few months ago, we caught USAID giving $1 million to a group that was working with Ismail Haniyeh's son in Gaza, who is himself a Hamas minister. So no, government money is plentiful under both parties. This is both Republicans and Democrats happily give to Islamists. In fact, it reached its peak under Trump, surprisingly. I think around 4 times the amount under Trump than Obama. But both parties have been dreadful when it comes to this question. As for the Jewish community, yes, Jewish organizations, certain Jewish organizations have been spectacularly stupid when it comes to dealing with Islamists. Many are willing to embrace groups that will say nice interfaithy things in public, but then behind closed doors say the most appallingly violent and hateful things as well, despite being fully aware. I mean, I'll just give you an example. A few years ago, I was dealing with a situation in Champaign, Illinois, where the local mayor appointed a rabid anti-Semite from the Muslim American Society to the local, I think it was an anti-racism board at the town. So it wasn't quite called that. It was something like that. Anyway, this man we'd caught calling for the killing of all Jews. And they made him the anti-racism commissioner of this town. When we brought it up, not only did the local newspaper accuse us of Islamophobia for focusing on this poor man and his quiet desire to eradicate the Jews, local Jewish community didn't want to act because they didn't want to ruin their relationship with local Muslims and also with the mayor. So this is a problem I've seen across the country. I'll never forget when the Anne Frank Trust in the UK decided to run an event with genocidal Salafis who were openly working with Al Qaeda. I mean, it's quite amazing how much of a blind eye certain Jewish organizations are willing to turn. So yeah, no, it's a huge problem, and Jewish indifference to the Islamist threat or fear, or whatever you want to say, drives it, has actually helped Islamists flourish in the West enormously. I'm particularly familiar with the Jewish institutions in Britain, where for years, major Jewish organizations such as the Board of Deputies, the elected body of British Jewry, were working with anti-Semites, Hamas-aligned Islamists in the interfaith world, despite being warned by moderate Muslims to stop it, that they were enabling anti-Semites. They carried on working with them because they didn't want the optics of having to challenge them in public. So this is a problem across the West. Jewish organizations are very bad at standing up to true anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, they're often happy to focus on perfunctory anti-Semitism. I remember campaigns by the Board of Deputies or various Jewish groups in the UK to go after clothing brands because there'll be a piece of clothing with what looked like the Star of David in a demonic or something like that. Sort of quibbles with the way that a certain Jewish symbol was represented. And Jewish organizations will spend a lot of time on that, but they wouldn't deal with the fact that across the country, hundreds of mosques, thousands of imams were openly calling for the killing of Jews, and they were getting government monies to do so. They were receiving flattering, sycophantic puff pieces in the media. The Jewish community's focused on the wrong thing. And now what's happened post October 7th, they've suddenly realized that they have a nation of anti-Semitic Islamists and their far left backers willing to march on the streets calling for their eradication and sympathizing with their eradicators. Yeah, for decades, Jewish organizations and Jewish activists have looked the other way, and now we're paying for it.
Yes.
So
Yes,
what can we? How can we get?
and also the Council of American Islamic Relations, CARE, has been working with I think it was the Anti-Defamation League, and they have been partnering in the White House strategy against U.S. anti-Semitism. They have been the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, has been partnering with the American Jewish Committee. So yes, our main Jewish organizations are very much working together with main organizations of Islamists in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
In short of a crystal knot, how can we get Jewish organizations, which is at the time the German Jews started to pay more attention to what Hitler had been saying for years? How can we get Jewish organizations now to really pay attention and to be willing to get past their fear and do something now instead of later, as our show is called, Never Again is Now?
I'm not part of the Jewish community. I don't understand it. I certainly don't understand the political choices some of its groups has made. I don't have a good answer to that other than form alternative organizations. Start fighting back yourself, because heaven knows I've seen people over the years try to influence Jewish leadership organizations to do the right things. I've never seen them succeed. I'm beginning to think the only thing to do is to replace them. I don't know though. I'm as I say, I may be Jewish, but I'm not part of the community. I don't involve myself in anything, so I don't know what the best way is. Certainly, sharing information about Jewish community Islamist partners. Groups like Islamic Relief, a major humanitarian aid charity, funds Hamas in Gaza, openly spreads hateful rhetoric about Jews. Even its US staff include rabid anti-Semites. Yet across the UK, the US, Canada, Jewish organizations work, hand in hand with Islamic Relief. It's very close coordination. And it seems to me, no matter how much the extremism of Islamic Relief is brought to light, it still finds Jewish partners. So yeah, the more one can do to share information, I think the better. But ultimately, I think, podcasts like your own, groups like the Clarity Coalition, as many organizations as possible that can be set up to draw attention to this, the better.
Sam, can you please tell us about the global Islamist economy? How much money goes around in Islamist activity? Where does it come from, and where does it go to?
That's an interesting question. It's incredibly wealthy, Islamism, globally. I think, a decade or so ago, we would have guessed that most of the money is coming from the East and going into the West. So Saudi, for example, and others. But actually, Western Islamism now is incredibly wealthy. It has billions of dollars in assets. It reports, it moves hundreds of millions of dollars every year through vast networks of 501(c)s and corporations and so on. In fact, we see more money leaving the country from American Islamism from west to east now than we do coming in. So things have really, really changed. Globally, it's driven also by these oil-rich states. So Qatar is a big one. Turkey may not be doing so well economically, but it still is a powerful financial force. In the East, we're seeing countries like Malaysia play an increasingly important role in the financing of Islamism. Iran, of course, is a whole other area of concern as well. So there's a huge amount of money moving around. There are efforts to diversify that economy, as you call it, not just from funding nonprofits, but into the for-profit scene as well. So there's particularly strong moves, especially by regimes such as the Turkish regime, to build a generation in the West of what they call the Muslim economy. So Muslim entrepreneurship, which on the face of it sounds great until you realize that a lot of it is driven by Islamist interests. So there's a lot of investment into fintech, financial technology, a lot of investment into cryptocurrencies, that sort of thing. A huge number of banks are currently being established by Islamist groups around the world that then want to replace conventional lending options with Islamically acceptable halal mortgages, halal loans, that kind of thing. So this is a huge area. And the US is a rather nice place to track it because it's much easier to track how money moves in this country compared to other countries, thanks to freely available 990 tax returns and so on. But all in all, yes, you see hundreds of millions of dollars moving every year and billions of dollars in assets and tens of thousands of people involved in this enormous industry that is financing the next generation of Islamist thought. People talk about Jewish control, but really, when you look at the sheer scale of the Islamist financial operation, it's far more convincing to believe in the Islamist ability to influence over a Jewish one. It's a remarkably powerful industry, and its true extent, I think, is still yet to be uncovered and understood.
And does that some of that money or how much of that money goes to causes that are directly influencing our or threatening our freedom right now?
Yes, yes. I mean, most of it, is the vast bulk of the richest network in American Islamism is that Virginia network I mentioned earlier. It's called the SAR network, or sometimes the SAFA network, and they have hundreds of millions of dollars themselves in assets that fund not just these Hamas charities I've mentioned, but also mosques across the country, international pressure groups from South Africa to Brussels to the United Nations. The influence is extraordinary, and the threat from these groups is significant. That the money used, that it's very clear when you look at the money controlled by the 501(c) Islamist 501(c) industry in the United States, the vast majority of it is Islamist controlled. Moderate Muslims, those Muslims who are truly standing up to Islamists or who have nothing to do with Islamists, are penniless in comparison. There are a few small exceptions. The Ismaili community, for example, is quite wealthy, and they tend to not be Islamist at all. But for the large part, when you come to normative Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, no, the radicals hold the purse strings. And that's a very frightening prospect for the future of Western Islam.
Felix?
Evelyn, I think we're coming to the end. Do you want to ask another question? I think really that Sam has already talked about, and perhaps I will repeat what we need to do here in America. We need to make our Jewish organizations understand what's happening. They really need. I'm not going to call for the change in leadership because I don't have that position, but I certainly think that we need to do something about our Jewish leaders understanding what's going on. I know, Evelyn, you and I have discussed it before, so this is not new to us, but Sam made a very clear picture of what's going on. So unless you have another question, I'd like to ask him what he'd like
Well,
to wrap
yeah,
up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Say so, Sam. What can our individual listeners do? We have mostly Jewish listeners. Not only we have listeners mostly in the United States, but all over the world. What can our individual listeners do to help stop the threat of Islamism?
Well, the forum doesn't just research; we also campaign. Um, so one thing that we would certainly welcome is if you wanted to join the Middle East Forum's efforts to lobby our legislators to make sure the law is changed, that existing law is enforced. That is an extremely important step to take. There's a huge amount that needs to be done in DC, but also in state legislatures across the country. So the Middle East Forum operates something called MEF Action, and you can Google that. Your listeners
We'll,
can Google that and
we'll
please get
put your
involved. But
URL.
more generally, I'm sorry, say again.
We'll put the URL, of course, in the description. Go
Oh,
ahead.
of course. Thank you. Yeah. No, more generally, I think it's about keeping an eye on what Islamists are doing in your area, what radicals are doing, making sure that the Jewish community speaks out when anti-Semitism takes place, making sure that politicians don't allow terror-supporting charities to operate with impunity. So write to your legislators, call out your supporters, make sure the media is covering this. It's amazing how little the media covers and deliberately turns a blind eye to. So no, there's a huge amount you can do, and just by being a little bit active, by reaching out, by making some noise, I think we could exert a significant difference. American media is weak on both sides. It covers what is suitable for whatever party that media supports. And Jews and Islamism are not part of the news right now, even with what's going on in Israel. It's truly anti-Semitism and Islamism are not properly covered by American media. So we have to do what they're not doing. So the more you can get involved with groups like the Clarity Coalition, with organizations like the Middle East Forum, the more we can do to actually draw attention to this and start fighting back.
And so when we speak out, and when we speak up about Islamists in our area, um, we need facts. We need facts. Where can we find those, Sam?
Well, I'm afraid there aren't many groups researching this these days. The Middle East Forum is one. So please, follow our site. We run an outlet called Focus on Western Islamism. You can also follow that. MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute, is very good. I encourage your listeners to subscribe to that. And then I'm afraid the rest of it is up to you. Keep an eye on your local Islamist institutions. If you want to know what those institutions are, get in touch. We can provide a list. We can advise. Keep an eye on your local media, your local city council. They'll almost certainly, if you're in even a medium-sized city, Islamists will be working through your council, attempting to impose themselves and grow their own influence. Keep an eye on what happens in your area. And please, feel free to get in touch and ask us if you want help. We're always willing to lend a hand.
In fact, I wanted to say, when a group in any city says, oh, let's have an interfaith thing and we'll partner with X group, they can reach out and ask you and vet that group instead of just willy-nilly believing the propaganda of that group that's in English and not in different languages, right? They can.
Well, absolutely. No, please get in touch. We're more than happy to vet an organization for you. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and that's something that I know Evelyn and I have talked about. It's very, very important, rather than partnering with just a group that reaches out to you. Oh, that's nice. So reach out to Sam and the others in his group. So Sam, I thank you so much. Really, this has been such an important interview. And I thank our listeners, those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast at YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.